I'm just curious, as an outsider, you're not in the US, but you're witnessing these sort of fractures take place.
Yeah.
The right is fracturing a little bit. The progressives and even Democrats are overwhelmingly as a base against Israel's genocide. And I don't know, what do you think that means for US public support helping that collapse? Because the US, you do need public support in the US for Israel to sustain this ironclad relationship in the future.
Yeah, definitely. We are in a dark moment in history, not just in Palestine. And not just in the United States. Populist and fascist governments exist elsewhere in Europe and in some parts of the global south. And if they are not in government, they are increasing their political power. But I believe history is cyclic, not linear. That means that we are, I think, at the end of this bad chapter and not the beginning, because there is a limit to how much you can sustain imperial control. And therefore, I do think that the resistant axis will return.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Is Zionism nearing its end? That's the argument of Ilan Pappé, Israeli historian, professor, and author of many books, including The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine and his latest, Israel on the Brink. He's called the genocide in Gaza the last stage of Zionism, not because things aren't horrific, but precisely because they are. Based on his study of history, Pappé says Zionism has entered its final phase, marked by brutality, disintegration, and eventual implosion. Today, we'll unpack why he believes this, what it means for Palestine, and what comes after. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Ilan Pappé, welcome to Dispatches. It is an honor to have you on.
Thank you, Rania. It's a great pleasure to be with you in this program.
Well, there's so much I want to ask you about, and I think our audience is really going to enjoy hearing from you because you have been making a very important argument describing Gaza as this last stage of Zionism. I think we're all feeling quite defeated and depressed as we reach this 2-year mark of this horror that we're witnessing in Gaza. And I've been watching your recent speeches, I've read all your recent stuff, and you've specifically said you're not coming at this from a place of optimism where Zionism's like coming to an end, but this kind of conclusion from history. And after all, you are a historian. So I want to start there. I was wondering if you could maybe walk us through the processes that you see that demonstrate Zionism nearing its end.
Yeah. First of all, I have to preface and say clearly that I'm talking about the beginning of an end. Namely, this is a long process. And I wish I could have good news for the people of Gaza or the West Bank or for Palestinians, wherever they are, and say that somehow I can see something in the very near future that would change dramatically the way they live and the way that they are exposed to the aggression of Israel and its policies. Unfortunately, this is not the case. What I feel I'm confident enough to say is that there are undercurrents below the surface, processes which I can already detect that I believe have a potential. Not each process by itself, but when these processes come together in a moment in history, in our case, in a moment in the future, they have the potential to transform dramatically the reality in historical Palestine and in fact change the life for Palestinians who are also refugees and live in exilic communities. And the processes, the first one that I can see, and you rightly said, I'm not seeing it as an activist. I'm really analyzing them as a political scientist, as an historian. It doesn't matter, as a scholar. is the implosion of the Israeli Jewish society from within. This is very little to do with the Palestinians, but it is very important for the future of Palestine because a Jewish society that lacks cohesion, that is suffering from what one can call almost a civil war between two distinct groups of people who find it very difficult to establish a common base, who always thought that maybe the so-called common enemy from the outside or the enemy from within, the Palestinians, would be enough to be a cement to create a collective identity, a collective share of responsibility. All that Gaza has proved is not working. These are two different interpretations. What does it mean to be a Jew in historical Palestine? For one, it's a liberal kind of Western interpretation of Judaism, while at the same time totally accepting the apartheid state and the criminal policy towards the Palestinians, but nonetheless thinks that Jewish life should be democratic and open. And the other one sees Jewish life as theocratic and see the secular Jews as much as enemies as the Palestinians, or as obstacles for having the right kind of Jewish state. It used to be an intellectual debate, but it became now a political one, an ideological one. Since the other group, which I call the State of Judea, the one that believes in theocracy and wants to build a greater Israel, not only over Palestine, but also over parts of Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, is now in power. And it causes the other side to actually leave rather than fight in many ways. So that's a very fundamental weakness. This leads to other weaknesses. It leads to policies that we have seen in Gaza. The other side of the genocide is the side of the exhaustion of the Israeli army and the Israeli economy. This is such an liability in terms of in economic terms and in terms of military terms, that it won't be easy, even when this particular chapter would come to an end, to rebuild a viable economy or to sustain an army that maybe should be able to deal with guerrilla forces like Hezbollah or Hamas. But should there ever be a change in the way the Arab countries perceive Israel, if they will perceive it as they did in the past, as an existential danger, and after the attack on Qatar, you can see the return of such a discussion, then this army has very little chance, I think, of avoiding or confronting military pressure. To that, you can add the international isolation of Israel, which so far is mainly in the global society or civil society level, but it begins to influence policies from above, and that means that a boycott can be replaced by sanctions, and you can add to this a young Jewish generation, especially in the United States, that disassociates itself from Israel. And finally, I would say two things. One is the Palestinian liberation movement right now is not in a very good moment, not in terms of its political elite, leadership, its unity, it's fragmented and so on. But I think the younger generation is building and has the potential to build a far more united, organized liberation movement, which will also be a very important factor. Especially with, I think, a different vision about what should be the future. And that would force the region and the international community to receive a Palestinian position very different from the one that they hear today from the PA. And the last is the Arab world. I don't think we have seen the end of changes in the Arab world, neither in Lebanon nor in the Mashriq as a whole, and further afield. And therefore, I do think that any such changes are for the benefit of the Palestinians and would weaken, again, the kind of Zionist regime that we are witnessing today.
There are so many threads that I want to pull on in what you just said. But before I do, I just want to go to the issue of the sort of um, insane level of brutality that we're witnessing and how that plays into this. And I heard you talk about this before in terms of making parallels to other places in the world throughout, let's just say, the last 100 years, where near the end they were acting out with just the most insane level of atrocity and criminality. And I was curious if you could just make those
Yeah,
parallels here.
yeah. This is an important point because what seems to many to be a counter argument to my optimism is to say, look, how can you be optimistic when you see the brutality of the Israeli government, and unprecedented brutality even compared to the way they behaved in the past? And I say, yes, but that's exactly what I mean from an historical perspective, that because this particular regime is under pressure and because it has such extensive fractures in its foundations, it uses more and more lethal and brutal force in order to try and sustain it, because anything else is not working. And I gave the example of the apartheid regime in South Africa, which was particularly brutal in its last days. And of course, when you lived in those last days, even if you were a member of the ANC, you did not feel that there is a hope of defeating it because it was so brutal. But it was that happened very near to the collapse of the regime, and there are other good historical examples for that. So I think that that brutality is the kind of very bitter realization that one brings to the discussion, that on the one hand you know who are the victims of this brutalization, and you don't wish for it, but you say once it's there, you also see something that can come out of it. Kind of seeing the moon rising after a dark night, or something like that. But it is very realistic approach to say that unfortunately, what we're talking here is probably decolonization, which in history is not a nice affair. It's never an easy one. It's not a non-violent one, as many people wish it to be, and it has upsets and a lot of hurdles on the way. But I do believe it's important to ask ourselves: are we in the beginning of that? And if we are, it does give us some hope for the future.
So I'd like to zoom in on specifically Israeli Jewish society, because you were talking about, I mean, that was one of the main points you were discussing in terms of the potential ruptures within Zionism, is that you have these two sections of society. And here you're talking about, secular Israeli Jews of the more liberal sort of European variety, and then these more sort of religious Messianic types who have taken a lot of power. You call it like the Judea nation. I think you've referred to it as that before. So I'm curious if you can elaborate a bit more on what form you see that implosion taking, I guess.
Yeah.
In terms of, are we talking about immigration? Because we have seen these numbers of people who are dual nationals leaving the country over the last couple of years for a variety of reasons, and including the fact that Israel is now a place that's just kind of constantly having to deal with cycles of being hit with either rockets, or in the case of the recent round with Iran, ballistic missiles, or whenever the Yemenis hit. And then also just this sort of infighting within Israeli Jewish society.
Yeah, definitely. What I call the state of Judea is the kind of group that emerged in the Jewish settlements in the West Bank and expanded into Israel itself, attracting mainly second and third generation of North African Jews, or Jews who came from Arab countries, but not only, also Jews who came from Russia and other places, people who were pushed to the social and economic margins and geographical margins of the Israeli society after they arrived as immigrants, and building quite a power base in the country, and going unnoticed for a while because people didn't take them seriously. And we know that from the history of fascism, that's how fascist parties come into power in the West. And eventually, in November 22, aligned themselves with Netanyahu, who, for his own reasons, decided to use them as allies because they were the only allies who probably would keep him in power. Now, they have already taken over, in many ways, the military elite, the security elite, definitely the political institutions. They are not yet controlling the economic elite and not the judicial system, but they are making quite headway in both these other areas of governments or institutions, or governmental institutions, and therefore I think that one has to ask who will oppose them in how they will be opposed, and I think that the attempt of the other side, what I call the old kind of state of Israel, will be to, as they already do, to have these massive demonstrations which become more and more violent by the day, and to try and to keep at least the judicial system under their control, or the academia for that matter. But you are right. I think so many of them, because of their dual nationality and because they have professions that they can reignite outside, are leaving in great numbers. Nobody knows the real numbers. Might be 500,000, but we don't really know. The Israeli Bureau of Statistics is very cagey about that. They would leave eventually. That's my prediction, that they would leave the battle eventually. So it's not implosion in the sense of an ongoing and never-ending civil war, the kind that we've seen in Lebanon and other places. It's much more than a takeover by an ideological group which will really make anybody who supports Israel today, apart from, lunatic populist presidents like Trump or I don't know, but any other, whether they are, Arab rulers or presidents or prime ministers of countries all over the world, would make it very, very difficult to provide the same immunity for Israel as they had provided until today. So it's an implosion in the sense that it becomes a society that does not hide its racist, fascist, aggressive, and expansionist ambition, which would pose a big challenge to everyone who in the past, first of all, helped to establish the state of Israel and then maintain it. And they would ask themselves, even right-wing Republicans would ask themselves, is this an asset, really, to America? Because such a project, if I'm right, that the state of Judea swallows the state of Israel, would cost the American taxpayer much more than it costs them today, because it would not generate its own wealth. It would need the American help for this. So this is the process I think that might take place.
No, it's really interesting, because also what you're talking about with regard to the way that Israel responds to the region as a whole. I mean, since October 7th, we've seen the most insane statements, not just towards Palestinians, but now you see Israel going to the UN and talking about the Qataris, the way they talk about Palestinians after they bombed Doha, which, I mean, I'm still trying to kind of wrap my head around the fact that
Yes.
happened last week. We were watching from here just being like, what? So I guess to start off there, I want to ask you, how did October 7th, do you think alter Israel's trajectory, like both internally and regionally? Because here in Lebanon, people keep talking about the current time we're in as if we're in greater Israel times, right? Like you have Israel trying to expand into Syria, into Lebanon in a pretty dramatic way, bombing Doha, bombing Yemen, bombing everything. And really just not even really trying to align itself or speak nicely about the people in the region who want to ally with the Israelis, like the new government in Syria, for example.
Absolutely. This is the moment. It's a fair description of the moment. I'm just stressing again that this is the moment and not an eternity. but it's an important moment. It's a moment, and maybe the best way of explaining it is to go a little bit into the mindset of the present political elite that runs Israel. And it's, I mean, putting for a moment Netanyahu aside, because I really don't think he has a clear ideology apart from staying in power. But so it's important. What is important are his ideological allies. And they are very clear. They do have an ideology, they do have a vision. And they really are believing that this is a rare historical moment, something that also Christian Zionists agree with them, the kind of the big blow, the big explosion that is necessary in order to rebuild God's kingdom on earth. A very different version in the case of Jewish fundamentalism and Christian fundamentalism, but the trajectory is the same in that respect. So the war in Gaza is welcomed in that respect because it's part of this explosion needed to create. And what do they think that they are able to create is to reconstruct the biblical kingdoms of David and Solomon that they have read about in the Old Testament, in the Bible, which stretches much not only over historical Palestine, but also into parts of neighboring countries, creating in Jerusalem the power of the region as a whole, which everybody submits to, is subjected to, and if not, is being punished. And this is how they see the bombing in Qatar, the bombing in Syria, the bombing in Lebanon. They feel that they are now the masters of the region. And one has to say the feeble reaction of the Arab states doesn't give them any reason to think otherwise. And that is something that encourages them to believe that the trajectory is the right one. I don't think they will succeed. I really don't think so. I think that they will fail. And this is why I see them as one of the major factor in the disintegration of the Zionist project. But they will attempt to implement such a vision, and that is always carries with it a lot of people who will be victimized by this attempt, and many of them will be, of course, Palestinians. But yes, but this is the mindset. It's the same mindset of the Minister of Home Security, or whatever they call it here, National Security in Israel, Ben Gvir, who goes to the prison to meet Marwan Barghouti in order to show him aerial photos of the wiping out of Rafah and Gaza City. It's the same mindset. It's like it's a very primitive Orientalist way of looking at Arabs, believing that that's what you should show them, how powerful you are, but also an almost insane belief in your own power to do whatever you want. They will learn, of course, this is not the case. But history teaches us that it doesn't happen in a day or two.
Oh, absolutely. And, when you look at the region right now, or when I look at the region, at least, what I see is a place that's been completely subjugated and pacified. Whatever country you look at right now, whether we're talking about the countries that are already normalized, like Jordan and Egypt, where they just have these police states that make it impossible for people to do anything. Whether you have the Gulf states, which is a totally different can of worms. Yeah. Or whether you talk about, places like Lebanon and Syria. In the case of Lebanon, you have the U.S. and the Israelis doing a pretty successful job so far of kind of turning the Lebanese government and army, or attempting to turn them into a kind of Palestinian Authority type institution that actually works to disarm people and not even try to protect them from Israeli aggression. And that's playing out in this country in a very dangerous way right now. And then you have the Syrians, you had the change in government, and now this new government basically begging the Israelis to be their friends, and Israel's still bombing them and still destabilizing and doing all the things they do. And it seems to me like a lot of the pressure, I think that the resistance in this region has done everything it can do. and it could only go so far. And I mean, the rest of the pressure has to come from the rest of the world. And I guess that brings me to, I've heard you say this and it's quite depressing, but you basically say Gaza can't be stopped. And I think 2 years on, we see that, right? Like there's been no red line. I was quite naive in the beginning of this, thinking that surely the Western countries at some point would say, okay, enough. You've had 2 months of this, enough. You've had 5 months of this, but we're almost 2 years in and nobody's shutting off weapons supplies, or sanctioning Israel yet. So now we see the Israelis going after the West Bank. And I guess I'm just curious, do you see any way to prevent the worst of the worst here?
Yeah, well, I can see some sort of a scenario in the near future, which has, I hope, the potential, of course, not to change dramatically everything, but maybe to tame the Israeli actions in a way. I think that nobody is going to stop the Israeli army from going into Gaza City, as they are already doing. Nobody will be able to stop them from massive expelling the people of the city into Khan Yunis and other places. I think that they will begin to wear out in two fronts. That would bring a lull, at least, that one prays the international community would use to make an impact that would do much more than just stop the genocide. One is that the economic and military burden of the soldiers and the society as a whole begins to be very visible in Israel, and there is a time limit. There's a time limit on continued military operations in Gaza, and that might eventually at least de-escalate or decelerate some of the actions. More importantly, I think, is that I do believe that the Egyptian government would not open the border for 1 million or 1.5 million Palestinians to cross over, which is what Israel and Trump are dreaming of. So what they will do instead, they will try and build what they're already beginning to plan, what they call the refugee city, the big city adjacent to the border between Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula. And this will bring constant friction with the Egyptian army. Egypt already violated, understandably, its peace treaty with Israel by sending forces into the border with Israel. And a constant military Israeli presence, a heavy military presence on the border with Egypt would cause such tension that especially the Americans would be alarmed by that. So I'm talking here about, pain pills to a real disease. So it's not something that is dramatically changing, but it at least hopefully creates a very long lull in the attacks, because Rania, and everybody who listens to us know that as we speak, the Israeli Air Force is bombing high-rise buildings in Gaza. People are being killed queuing for food and medicine. And the carnage is a daily business in the Gaza Strip, and not that far from that in the West Bank. So we should hope at least for that, even if that, of course, is not a let-off in terms of the Israeli policy. So there are factors that can, first of all, tame the Israelis and eventually at least stop the present carnage. Much depends a lot on Europe. What is really quite incredible, that the Europeans were blowing out of proportion the myth that a lot of people believe also in the Arab world, that the only way of stopping Israel is through Washington, that the key is in Washington. This is very convenient for the Europeans because it absolves them from doing anything. So what do you want from us? That it's the Americans. But this is not true. The main trade partner of Israel is the EU. And if the EU would stop trading with Israel, if it would impose sanctions, it would throw Israel from UEFA, the Football Association, or the Eurovision,
Mhm.
which are symbolic acts, but very important symbolic acts. All this can have a very strong effect on the Israeli government and its policies. Again, not to change dramatically its perception and its vision of the future, but at least to stop for a while and end the killing fields of Gaza. And that is something that I hope that Europeans are beginning to understand. In that respect, what we talked about before, the passive policies of the Arab governments, at least should count for something that, which is true, that they are not eager to go into military confrontation with anyone. And Europe, for years, accepted the Israeli narrative that they need to be the strongest army in the world and to have 250 nuclear bombs because what do Arab regimes do? They keep contemplating and planning every day to destroy the state of Israel. We can see that this is not true. This is absolutely not true. And it's exactly the opposite. In fact, they're just looking for a way to appease the Israelis and so that they would leave them alone. And they are pressured by their own societies, of course, to show solidarity with the Palestinians. But at least that should convince the European. The problem here is not Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, in terms of instability and violence in the region. There's only one state that uses its army to terrorize and intimidate, and that country, that state, is considered by Europe to be almost an organic part of the EU. And that has to
Yeah.
change. That has to change dramatically. Yeah.
I am curious. You are a historian who's a scholar of the Nakba. You have a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine that
Right.
details the massacres and the depopulation and what the founding Zionists did to create the state of Israel. And you've studied what's happened since, and you're witnessing, Gaza. We're all watching it be live streamed, and also you come from this society, and you've come out quite differently than most people in Israeli Jewish society. So I guess I'm just curious, on a personal note, are you surprised by the behavior of the Israeli military? I guess maybe not surprised by atrocities. Obviously, we've all seen for decades Israeli committing atrocities across the region, but just the level of depravity and just how far right, how fascist this place has become. Does that surprise you?
Yeah. No, I don't think I was. Unfortunately, I wrote in 1999 already an article that was published in a Journal of Palestine Studies, in which I examined the Israeli educational system, the state educational system. And I wrote in that article that 20 years from 1999, this system would produce only one kind of graduates: racist, with lack of any human sympathy and compassion to anyone who's not Jewish, and totally anti-democratic political orientation. And I was right. So I saw the kind of collective mentality that the young generation of Israeli soldiers have as already in action in the checkpoints in the West Bank, in the previous military assaults on the Gaza Strip, and the behavior towards the Palestinian citizens of Israel. So I was not surprised at their total inhumanity and lack of compassion towards children, women, and so on. You never expect, even in your darkest dream, that kind of carnage, that kind of destruction. Bombing hospitals, schools, universities, bombing buildings that are World Heritage. They bombed some of the most beautiful architectural gems that survived all the occupiers of Gaza since the age of the Mamluks, since the medieval time. They survived everything, including two world wars, and the Israeli bombed them just as part of their idea of a punitive action, and much more than that, as part of their attempt to send a message to the people of Gaza that they cannot stay and live in Gaza. And by that destroying both the objects of destruction, the level of destruction is something I didn't predict. But I must say this, as a whole, this did not surprise me, unfortunately. What did surprise me is the European indifference. I mean, I really thought this would be a red line. I mean, if a genocide is not a red line, what will be a red line?
Yeah, we live in a world now where there isn't any.
Yeah, that was really something I still find incomprehensible. I wrote articles explaining why, but I'm not satisfied with my own explanation. It's a partial explanation because it's very difficult to comprehend and accept.
It really is. It really is. And I guess from that, I'd want to ask you, how did you, like, on your own personal journey, how did you come out of this society you just described, where it's like almost like an experiment to see how fascist you can, make people, or whatever the conditions you can create to lead to this? How did you come out the way you are? You're anti-Zionist. You speak Arabic. You speak Arabic with other Arabs. And when I hear you speak, I mean, you sound just like the rest of the people around me. So yeah, how did you come out so different from the people you grew up with?
Yeah, well, it was a journey. I should say I'm not the only one. We're not a large number, unfortunately. I wish we were. And probably each one of us had a little bit of a different trajectory outside of Zionism, but there are some common feature. It's a journey that, in my case, had a lot to do with the career I decided to pursue as a very young person. Namely, I was very much interested in history, and I wanted to work as a professional historian. I was very attracted to this idea, this kind of work and career, and that I thought that the best way of doing it was outside of Israel, when I was still very much under the influence of the Zionist ideology as a young man, and being able to work on history from the outside, meeting for the first time Palestinians on an equal footing, meeting people from the Arab world that there was no chance I could have met them before. This was, of course, because before the age of internet, so there was no way of meeting people unless you could see them physically. And that contributed, and it's a journey. It doesn't happen in a day. It's not an epiphany. And I wish I could work out a model by saying, okay, so let me suggest to others to do the same.
Right.
But apparently it doesn't work that easily in other cases. It's a very personal issue. It has to do with your moral constitution, has to do with your perception of what is important and not important in life. But there is this moment where you don't look back, of course. I'm always elated when I meet, and I do meet, some young Israeli Jews who are beginning to undertake a similar journey. I'm always despairing and depressed that the numbers are so low. But it's possible. What I'm trying to say, it's possible. In fact, it's one of the main things that really surprises you in a society like Israel. As a Palestinian, you really have to be very, very courageous if you challenge Israel as a Palestinian citizens of Israel. You are facing a very fierce regime that would punish you. It's not the same for Israeli Jews. And, when Israeli Jews say to me, we don't understand how the Germans didn't do anything during the time of the Holocaust, I say to them, but a German who dared to challenge the Nazis, at best would be just executed, at best.
Mm-hmm.
and you're not facing at all such a risk. So you're not challenging the Zionist ideology because you are afraid of being tortured or imprisoned. A Jewish dissident is not treated like that. It might be, I don't know, but so far they're not. And so the reason is that you are not convinced that there's a problem with the ideology, and that's very difficult to accept. I much more accept, I can accept fear. I can accept, I may not admire it, but I can understand it. If someone says to me, if I go against them, I will be imprisoned for life. Okay, so yes, not everybody can be so courageous. That's okay. But if the risk is not that, then it means that it's not the risk that makes my case and people like me so exclusive. It means that we didn't overcome a fear. We overcame an ideology with which we can totally not identify. In fact, an ideology that in our name is doing things that turned out us to very active people against it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I also asked this question too because I've heard you talking about, and I know in your book you have a book coming out. I think in a week, is that right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
The Israel on the Brink, which I'm very excited to read, and I've seen some descriptions of the different parts. And I know in that book you kind of have this imagined future of a
That's
one
right.
state, and you've been talking a lot about the idea of we need to be thinking about and planning for a day after, just like our enemies do, right? They're always
Yeah,
talking about a day after, though their day after is very dystopian. We don't want a dystopian day after, but
that's
mostly
right.
to avoid chaos and the mess of decolonization as you've described. And I think it's a really, really interesting question. And I know you're not necessarily trying to answer it because you say Palestinians should be leading that discussion. And I 100%
Absolutely.
agree. But one thing that I have heard a lot of from people, and I would apply this to even beyond Palestine, I would say more regionally in the Levant, but especially to Palestinians, is this idea of how on earth are we supposed to live with people, with a society that's right now trying to genocide us, and hopefully at some point that will have moved past that. But then how do you live with these people, right? And it's a good question. I don't necessarily know the answer to that,
Yeah.
but I people who were one state and still ideally are one state with democratic rights for everybody are now having this like debate amongst themselves of, can we even have one state with these people?
Yeah.
And I guess it's more just a comment than a question, but I guess I'm curious your
No,
thoughts.
it's an important point, and I'm fully aware of it, and I fully understand where it's coming from. And definitely, I just think that there is some responsibility for people like us to strategize. There's a difference between very genuine reaction to the genocide, and I think what really matters in that discussion that you just mentioned is people's realization how widely the genocide is supported by the Jewish society in Israel. And that leads to this very legitimate question, how can we live with people, not only that the government is perpetrating a genocide, that they support a genocide, which definitely is something a lot of other people in history ask when they were victims of genocides. Um, the strategy is not based on the wish to absolve the people who were the criminals, who committed the crime, who created the ideology for the crime, and so on. Their day will come. The question is, can you ignore the fact that there are 8 million Jews living between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean? 8 million people do not disappear in a day. And they are there not because they had the historical right to be there, but they are there. And they have been there now for more than a century. And therefore, the one state tries to, and I'm part of a movement which is called the One Democratic State. We are trying to imagine a decolonized Palestine where the Jews who stay in that decolonized place are either people who, in the next 15 or 20 years, would internalize at least some of the issues that they have to confront, or would feel that they have that in the two options that they have, to stay or to leave, they would rather leave. And I hope this would be the case with some of the Jews who came from the Arab countries, to understand that actually they belong to the Arab world and they were misled in this process of de-Arabization that they undertook, and therefore they will live in a very different context, which will include what we used to call transitional justice, very much like whites who were part of the apartheid regime in South Africa were able to reintegrate to post-apartheid South Africa, whether it's through a process of Truth and Reconciliation Committee, or there will be something more unique that the Palestinians would develop. I think this is that is the moment of strategic thinking, where indeed it is very, very difficult to request such a thinking at this particular moment, which I fully understand. I have, in this imaginary diary that I do in my new book, I have a conversation between children and a father who says, well, many of the Jews who used to live here in Haifa are gone. Why is that? They ask it's a granddad, actually. It's a conversation between grandchildren and a granddad. And the granddad says, who is Jewish, he says to them, I tried to convince them to stay. I told them it's much better to live in a democratic Palestine than being part of an apartheid Israel. But they were not convinced. So I didn't make a real effort to try and stop them. It's their choice. But he said, and he says to them, this was never a precondition for liberating this country from colonialism. And I think this is, it's a fictional conversation, but it's the one I had with myself and others. And yes, this is part of the process. But I fully understand the present position. And, we in the one democratic state, when we meet, we have this great problem, of course, of expanding our kind of membership, if you want. This is not a very good moment, especially not for people from the inside. I think from the outside, still Palestinians are willing to support, but it's also a generational thing as well, of course. And I can see that the younger generation, says, "Come on, we don't want to think of living with these people." But sometimes strategy requires a bit more kind of long-term planning and not just understandable reactions to a present reality.
Yeah. I mean, I also would sometimes when I look at, Israel from the outside, it reminds me of the right wing in the US, but like if the right wing in the US were a country of just the right wing in the US.
Yeah.
That's and there is like a very close partnership in that too.
Yeah,
like the Israel of today is just completely, mixed in with, sewed together with the Republican Party in the US and the far right there. And you've always argued that, the future of Israel and Zionism is tied to the future of America. And the current trajectory, or the present of America, is led by Donald Trump, who is just in lockstep. Israel, whatever they want to do, you go ahead and do it.
right.
So it seems like from this administration, which, God, I can't believe we're not even a year into it yet, and it already feels like 10 years.
Another 3 years. Yeah.
So we still have quite some time to go. I don't think there's going to be any stopping, any stopping Israel from the Trump administration. But what I do find interesting, in addition to the massive pro-Palestine movement in the US, which is quite large, has gotten so much bigger, and is under extreme attack right now, but still just managed to have this beautiful conference in Michigan just a few weeks ago where 4,000 people attended. It was organized by the Palestine Youth Movement. You also, though, have this weird, I don't want to give it too much credit as a good thing in any way, because it's, I think, coming from some really negative places, but this bizarre shift on the right in America with the Tucker Carlsons and the Candace Owens. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, You can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthroughnews.